The wedding reception glittered under a canopy of chandeliers. Champagne flowed freely. Nobody saw the trap being set. The bride broke away from her new husband and walked directly toward the grandfather she barely knew.
Mr. Vance, you've been served.
She pressed a legal envelope into his palm. The music died as if the conductor had been cut down. George Vance looked at the paper. His jaw tightened, but nothing else moved. Guests turned in their chairs. A champagne flute shattered against the floor. Jacob spun around from his best man's toast, his glass still raised, his face drained of color. George excused himself with a small nod to no one in particular and walked toward the edge of the room. He unfolded the document, his silver wristwatch catching the chandelier light. His eyes scanned the printed lies. A muscle ticked below his eye, but his voice never rose. He was already counting back. The words on the paper were clinical. Elder erratic behavior, pattern of intimidation, all of it false. Notarized by Linda Merritt, commission number 198384. That name. He had seen it before. In a file his accountant placed on his desk 3 weeks ago. The transfer authorization for Hart Holdings had been stamped by the very same notary, a coincidence too sharp to ignore.
She signed those transfers, and now she's trying to lock me out.
He refolded the document with the precise movements of a man who already knows his next 10 moves. Across the room, the bride laughed and spun in her new husband's arms. She thought she had won. George slipped the papers into his inside jacket pocket and let his eyes settle on her. Not with anger, with calculation. He didn't need to raise his voice. He had a different weapon now, a name. And in that moment, George Vance began to plan a counterattack that would unwind a marriage before the cake was even cut. 3 weeks earlier, in a quiet office downtown, George had already begun piecing together a puzzle. His accountant handed him a thin folder, worry tightening the man's grip on the paper. Inside were copies of wire transfer requests, each notarized and directed to an account called Hart Holdings. George traced the numbers. Small withdrawals at first, then sums that made his jaw tighten. The notary stamp on every page read, Linda Merritt, commission number 198384. George had never met this woman, but her name was linked to every questionable transfer. The accountant mentioned that Jacob's fiancée had authorized many of these transfers personally.
Why is money leaving Jacob's trust before he's even married?
He closed the folder and sat very still, storing the evidence away until the right moment arrived. Now, at the wedding, that same name on the restraining order lit up every alarm he had been nursing in silence. The string quartet resumed, and the dance floor filled with couples twirling under the warm light. When Jacob stepped off the floor to catch his breath, George was already at his elbow. The old man pressed a small silver thumb drive into his grandson's palm, his grip firm and final.
When you're ready to see the truth.
What truth? What could Grandpa possibly mean?
George didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked out through the grand double doors without looking back. Jacob stared at the drive in his hand, the noise of the party suddenly very far away.
Jacob, come dance with your wife.
He slipped the drive into his pocket and returned her smile, but the warmth never reached his eyes. The music played on, but Jacob heard only the echo of his grandfather's words, a seed planted in the dark. Morning light streamed through the curtains of the honeymoon suite, finding the discarded tuxedo jacket across a chair. Amelia was still asleep, her blonde hair a soft halo on the pillow, untroubled by the storm she had set in motion. Jacob sat up slowly, his head heavy. The night's fragments reassembled, the envelope, his grandfather's rigid back, the quiet weight in his palm.
He really gave me this. What am I supposed to do with it?
He turned to look at his wife. Her face was innocent in sleep, her breathing gentle, the perfect image of a woman with nothing to hide.
If there's nothing here, why did Grandpa walk out before the first dance?
The question gnawed. He slipped out of bed soundlessly, grabbed the laptop bag, and eased the bathroom door shut. In the small tiled room, The only light fell from a high frosted window. He sat on the cold floor, laptop balanced on his knees. The thumb drive slid into the port with a quiet click. A folder appeared on the dark screen. Vance Trust Transfer Records.
One click. That's all it takes.
He clicked. The folder opened into a grid of spreadsheets and scanned documents, each one a nail in a coffin he hadn't known was being built. Recipient, Hart Holdings. Authorized user, Amelia Vance.
Amelia? She's listed as the authorized user on my own trust.
The dates began 3 weeks after they got engaged. Small amounts at first, then 5-figure withdrawals like clockwork. Total transferred, $211,432.
Over $200,000 gone.
His fingers trembled on the trackpad, scrolling through months of betrayal that had been happening while he planned a wedding.
This was no mistake. This was a plan.
He pressed his palms into his eyes, as if he could unsee the numbers, then dropped his hands and stared at the screen again. The bathroom door was a thin wooden slab. On the other side, his wife slept peacefully, and everything he believed about his marriage was now a lie. Jacob opened the bathroom door, the laptop still hot in his hands. The room was unchanged, but the world had tilted. He sat on the edge of the bed and shook her shoulder. Not gently.
Jacob, what time is it? Why are you?
He turned the screen toward her. The spreadsheet glowed between them like an accusation.
What is this? I don't understand. Jacob, you're scaring me.
Your name is on every transfer. $200,000, Amelia. Tell me the truth.
It was supposed to be a surprise, a fund for our future. I was going to tell you after the honeymoon.
She reached for him, her fingers trembling against his wrist. The tears looked real. Or did they?
She's lying. She has to be. But her hands are so warm.
She clung to his arm, her tears hot on his skin. He didn't pull away. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Jacob pulled his arm free and stepped into the bathroom again, locking the door. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number he'd known since childhood. In his study, George answered on the second ring as if he'd been waiting.
Why didn't you warn me? You let me walk into this blind.
You needed to see it with your own eyes, Jacob. Love is a powerful blindfold. I have more. An affidavit from the notary. Linda Merritt has confessed.
In his study, George's hand rested on a thick envelope labeled affidavit, Linda Merritt.
Come to the house. Bring the laptop. You need to see the full picture before you decide what to do.
Jacob ended the call and caught his own reflection in the mirror, a man who no longer recognized his own marriage. He packed the laptop and slipped out, leaving Amelia's tear-streaked face half buried in the pillow. Jacob's car pulled up to the quiet brick house, the same house where he'd spent summers as a boy. George opened the door before he could knock. He wore no jacket, but his posture was as rigid as ever. They moved in silence to the study. A thick folder lay open on the desk, papers flagged with yellow tabs.
Read it. Then tell me if you still believe her tears were real.
The affidavit was signed by Linda Merritt. She admitted that Amelia and her brother Travis threatened to have her fired if she didn't notarize forged documents.
She forced a notary to lie, and then she used that to steal from me while I was planning our wedding.
Then George slid another stack across the desk, printed emails between Amelia and Travis. Cut him out. The old man won't know until it's too late.
This was never love. It was a strategy from the beginning.
Jacob lowered the papers. The room was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. He believed now. Jacob collapsed into the leather chair and buried his face in his hands. The silence was a held breath.
She planned everything. The wedding, the trust, the restraining order, all of it, just for money.
I know. That's why I've already spoken to Robert Cole. The annulment papers are ready.
George placed a steady hand on Jacob's shoulder. The weight of it was not comfort alone, but a promise.
But we must act now before the holiday weekend, when the courts close. Once we file, the trust can't be drained further.
Then let's do it. I want this marriage erased like it never happened.
Jacob pulled out his phone, thumbs moving fast. He typed a single word and sent it into the silence between them. Come. George's phone buzzed on the desk. He read the screen, then gave a single stoic nod. The word was not an invitation. It was a launch sequence. They reached the law office quickly. Robert Cole, sharp-eyed and precise, had the petition ready on the table. He explained the grounds: fraud and coercion. The court would grant the annulment if they proved bad faith.
Once we file, the trust is protected, but she must be served personally.
Jacob signed without hesitation. The pen felt heavy, but his hand did not shake.
I'm not just signing papers, I'm cutting her out of my life for good.
She will likely fight back, but the evidence is overwhelming. The notary's confession alone is damning.
We'll serve her ourselves at her brother's condo. She needs to look us in the eye when she gets these.
Robert pulled up the address on his phone, a luxury high-rise where Amelia had been staying since Jacob left.
I can't wait to see her face when she realizes the game is over.
George slid the folder under his arm. The wall clock read 11:20. It was time. Jacob entered the apartment to gather his things. He needed his passport, his laptop, and a reason to never come back. He pulled open a dresser drawer and froze. A cheap flip phone, not hers, sat among the scarves. He turned it on. A text thread with a contact labeled Trav filled the screen. Is the old man out yet? Papers served. Worked like a charm. Now the trust is ours. Love you, sis. Jacob's knuckles bleached white. The messages were from the reception, sent while he was dancing.
They were laughing at us, at Grandpa, while I spun her on the floor.
He took a screen capture, forwarded the worst to George, and slipped the phone into his pocket. The evidence was now complete. There would be no more doubt, no more hesitation. He packed his duffel bag with cold precision, leaving the wedding photo face down on the nightstand. The door closed behind him with a quiet click. He wasn't coming back. George's 1961 Continental idled at the curb, its engine a low, patient rumble. He never drove anything else. Jacob climbed into the passenger seat. The annulment folder, thick with evidence, rested between them.
I never thought we'd be driving to end my marriage together.
The car merged into downtown traffic. Neither man spoke. The city noise was enough. Skyscrapers loomed. The glass reflected a cold, indifferent sun.
We do this for your future. Not revenge. Remember that.
Jacob nodded. His hand brushed the burner phone in his pocket, a relic of her treachery. Travis's building rose before them, all sterile marble and mirrored glass. George pulled into the visitor's lane. They stepped out. George adjusted his charcoal jacket and tucked the folder under his arm like a second spine. The elevator ride was silent. When the doors opened on 14, George pressed the doorbell without hesitation. The door swung open. Amelia stood in a silk robe, her hair loose, her smile vanishing the instant she recognized them.
What are you doing here? You can't just show up like this.
George stepped past her without an invitation. Jacob followed, his jaw set. The door clicked shut behind them.
Read this. It's the annulment petition.
She took the papers, her fingers trembling. As her eyes scanned the words, her face flushed a deep, violent red. She let out a sharp, ugly laugh and tried to rip the pages in half.
No, it's over.
George stood back, his arms folded, the notary's affidavit and the burner phone texts a silent army at his back.
You think this means anything? I'll fight you both. I'll say you abused me, that you're senile.
But her voice cracked on the last word, because the man in the charcoal jacket wasn't blinking, and neither was her husband. Amelia dropped into a chair, arms tight across her chest. The torn petition lay on the glass table like a wound.
Sign now and the FBI files stay sealed. Refuse and your brother goes down with you.
The pen gleamed under the track lighting. Amelia stared at it as if it were a syringe. Her fingers wrapped around the barrel. She wrote her name in jagged, furious strokes, the ink bleeding into the paper. Jacob stepped forward and took the pen. His own signature was clean and deliberate, as if carving out a new life.
It really is over.
George lifted the pages, checked both signatures, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Amelia collapsed onto her folded arms, a muffled howl escaping into the glass table. The sound was ugly, not sadness but the noise of a plan that had detonated in her hands. George slid the folder into his jacket. The paperwork was complete. The marriage was legally extinguished. Before they could move, the door crashed open. Travis Hart stood in the frame, his face already twisted with rage.
What did you do to her?
He lunged forward, stabbing a finger at George. Amelia's weeping rose a pitch.
I'll destroy you both. You have no idea who you're dealing with.
The evidence is already with federal investigators, Travis. Your name is on every transfer. Linda Merritt's affidavit names you directly.
The color drained from Travis's face. His hand dropped to his side. Jacob stepped forward until his shoulder was even with his grandfather's. The two of them filled the room without another word. George turned toward the door. Jacob followed. The sound of Amelia's crying was the last thing they heard before the hallway swallowed them. The elevator doors slid shut, and the silence of the 14th floor was absolute but not peaceful. A fuse had been cut and lit at the same time. The investigation was about to sprint. In Robert Cole's office, affidavits, bank records, and emails covered the table. George and Jacob assembled the case like a weapon. They loaded sealed evidence boxes into a sedan, each bearing a case number destined for the FBI. The FBI field office received the files without ceremony. A clerk stamped the intake form. George signed a receipt. The machinery began to turn. Jacob returned to his apartment and purged every trace of Amelia, perfume bottles, the white dress bag, all into the hallway. Evenings, George sat in his wingback chair, a book unread, the grandfather clock pacing off the wait. Robert forwarded a scanned order. Restraining order dismissed with prejudice. George read it twice, then placed it in his desk. Jacob saw the update on his phone and exhaled. The paper cage was gone. Days progressed. Meetings with Robert. Follow-up calls. Quiet dinners Jacob made for himself.
Just give me the call. Let it be over.
And then on a Tuesday, when the light was thin, the phone finally rang. On Tuesday morning, federal agents walked into Travis Hart's glass-walled office. He looked up, and his future vanished. The silver cuffs closed around his wrists with a sound like a lock snapping shut on a cell. Across town, Amelia was escorted from her building. The mascara ran, but the agents' faces were stone. She tried the tears again. This time the audience was federal. The charm had been extinguished. George's landline rang at noon. He answered without hurry, already sensing the news. The trust is frozen. The assets are secure. The Hart case is officially open. The grandfather clock ticked on, but now it marked a different kind of time, the kind that follows justice. Jacob saw the breaking alert on his laptop. Hart arrested in fraud scheme. He read the headline twice. He set the laptop aside and stared at the wall for a long moment. The weight he'd been carrying released.
Thank you, Grandpa.
The court issued the annulment decree that afternoon. The language was dry, but it erased Amelia Hart from Jacob's life entirely. Trust balance. Vance Family Trust. All unauthorized transfers reversed. Principal restored. That evening, in George's study, the two men stood with a quiet drink. No speech. Just the clink of whiskey glasses.
You're free now. Take some time before you think about anything else.
I will, but first I need to clean my phone.
Jacob deleted Amelia's contact, then her photo, then every message. Each press felt like untying a knot. George adjusted his cuff. The silver wristwatch glinted, no longer a marker of a humiliating night, but of a patience rewarded. In the following days, the truth spread in quiet circles. The club members nodded. The barber spoke his name with respect. But George didn't care about reputation. He just wanted Jacob to sleep through the night again. And for the first time since the wedding, Jacob sat back and let the stillness settle. The furnace hummed. The clock counted peace. 3 years reshaped a life. Jacob's smile returned first, then his confidence, and eventually, a woman with kind eyes began sitting across from him. She never asked about the past. She only asked if he liked his coffee black.
I'd forgotten what real care looked like.
On a quiet Sunday, he carried an envelope to George's house.
I'm getting married again, Grandpa. To someone real, and I'm not letting you touch a penny.
About time, Jacob. Let me see this invitation.
The invitation was simple. No gold foil, just a name Jacob had learned to trust. George's vintage car sat in the driveway, a freshly pressed suit hanging in the back. He adjusted his silver tie in the mirror. The smile would not leave his face. The venue was a sunlit garden. Jacob had chosen every detail, paid for every petal. This time, the gift was his, and George arrived holding nothing but an invitation to dance. Jacob stood at the altar under a floral arch, morning light on his face, waiting without a trace of fear. The bride walked down the petal-strewn aisle, her gown simple, her smile as steady as the sunlight. George sat in the front row, his hands folded on his lap. His eyes shimmered, but he didn't blink. The rings slipped onto fingers without drama, only promise. When evening came, string lights draped the garden and tables filled with quiet laughter. George led the bride onto the floor. She looked up, and he guided her with the grace of a man who had finally let go. Then Jacob danced with him. No words, just the memory of a drive, a thumb drive, a signature. George closed his eyes for 3 beats, letting the music fill the warm evening. The world had spun backward 3 years before. Now it spun forward, and for once it was on their side. Some men pay for weddings. George paid for a lesson, and tonight, the lesson was redeemed. The dance wound down, and George stepped back, letting the younger couples fill the floor. He found a spot near the garden's edge, where the music softened and the stars had room.
A wedding is a promise, but a second chance is a wedding all its own.
He touched the silver wristwatch, a habit that now felt like a quiet tribute. The sun had long set, but the garden held onto the warmth. His work was done, the trust was whole, and the boy he'd raised was now a man who could stand alone. He didn't need to stay until the end. He had already seen the part that mattered. George turned and walked toward the gravel path, leaving the music behind. Some men pay for weddings. George paid for a lesson, and the lesson was this: real loyalty is quiet, patient, and waits until the music fades to show its worth. Fade to black.